All right, here we are. Welcome back to Ribbit Readings. It is 2026, and Richmond Survival Camp is on the horizon again. It has been 6 years since the first camp that I ever read for, the story at least, which was in 2020. Can you believe that? That is actually how this came to be. I initially started recording videos because I figured I worked full time. The campers, you all, also probably work full time. And there were people hosting story time in World to read parts of the 2020 camp story. I could never seem to make it to the times, and I'm sure a wealth of you also couldn't. So I thought, what if I just read them in my free time and popped them on my YouTube channel? Eh, Probably won't get any views, but I love reading, so I'll do it anyway. And you all supported that, which was amazing to the point where I made a Facebook group, I made a Discord, I made an in-world, and throughout the years I've gone on to read for camps, charity events, my own personal blog as a frog, like because of your support. And I don't, I appreciate it. I don't know how else to say it. Like, I have been reading to public since I was a little kid. I used to read for my mom's classes. She was a teacher, so all of her students, and I loved it. I don't know. I'm really excited I get to keep that hobby and grow that hobby here in this virtual world. So I figured I might as well dust off my little wee little top hat. See it up there on my head? And read you all the new tale of Richmond Survival Camp. We'll start with the opening note. A story told before every Richmond survival camp, so that those who come may understand what they are walking toward, though never quite sure enough to be ready for it. A note from whoever first wrote this down. Every town has a story to tell about itself, and most of them are lies dressed up as history, the lie, like the kind of lie that gets kinder with each retelling until nobody remembers that there was ever a sharper truth underneath. Richmond has one of those stories too. We tell it every year, a little differently, a little bit softer, and right up until the year we don't. This is the story as it has been pieced together from newspaper morgues gone brittle at the edges, from testimony given to men who didn't believe a word of it, from things certain families do not discuss at their own dinner tables, and from an old woman who used to sit on her porch on Miller Street and tell it to any child who'd sit still long enough to listen, always ending the same way. And that, sweetheart, is why we don't go near the fairground after dark. Read it before you come to camp. It will not tell you what you're walking into. Nothing can do that. But it will tell you why. And in Richmond, the why has always mattered more than anyone has ever wanted it to. Chapter 1. The Last Carnival of the Year. Before Richmond was known for anything else, it was known for this. It was known as the town where the carnival always came home. Not home in the sense of belonging to it. Gravely's Carnival of Wonders belonged to the road, the way all traveling shows do, moving from county fair to county fair, from spring mud to summer dust, a whole world of canvas and calliope music packed into rail cars and flatbed trucks and carried from one town's edge of town to the next. But every October, when the light went thin and the gold in the nights came down early, Gravely's finished its circuit in the same place it always had, on the same flat stretch of pasture at the edge of Richmond, where the Kessler family had once grown corn before Old Man Kessler sold the north acreage off in a bad year and never quite forgave himself for it. They called it the last carnival of the year, and it was not, in the town's memory, ever meant to be anything but a celebration. One final show before the show closed up for winter. One last night of noise and color and things that lit up in the dark before the whole county settled into a large gray months and everyone went back to being exactly who they were the rest of the year. Richmond loved it the way small towns love the thing that makes them feel once a year like the center of something larger than themselves. By 1958, the tradition was old enough that nobody in town could quite say when it had really started. Only that their parents remembered it, and their parents' parents, back to some hazy point where the story blurred into simple fact. The carnival always ends here. Children were born in years the carnival came, and their birthdays were half remembered by which acts had been new that season. Old men measured their own decline against the show. I used to be able to make that ring toss every year. Now my hands just won't do it. That was the way other towns' old men measured themselves against the harvests or war. And every year, on the final night, the town gathered at the edge of the Kessler pasture to hear the bell. It's worth understanding before anything else what kind of show it was. Not a cruel one. Well, not yet. Gravely's Carnival of Wonders was, by every honest account that survives, a genuinely wondrous thing to watch. A little threadbare at its seams if you looked too closely, the way every good traveling show is, but dazzling from the distance a paying audience was meant to stand at. It had been built up over generations by the Gravely family, passed down like a birthright that nobody in that family had ever seriously questioned wanting, until by 1958 it had come to rest under the stewardship of an aging showman everyone simply called Old Gravely. A man whose real first name had been swallowed so thoroughly by his stage title that even his own performers mostly forgot it. Old Gravely was tired that year, and everyone who worked under the big top knew it, in the particular way that a family knows when its head is starting to lean on someone younger. He had begun, over the previous 2 seasons, to let a great deal of the actual show, the pacing, the flourish, the address to the crowd, fall to the performer who was, by then, unmistakably, the heart of the whole operation. He didn't have a stage name recorded anywhere official. The surviving programs simply call him your ringmaster. In looping gold script, a title rather than a name, which in hindsight nobody in Richmond has ever found particularly comforting. He'd come up through the show as a boy, the way carnival children sometimes do. First as a hand who swept the sawdust and refilled the ring toss bins, then as a barker's understudy, then because he had a gift for it and even old Gravely couldn't pretend not to notice, as the man out front in the ring and in the light. He was, by every account, magnetic. Not handsome in any remarkable way, but watchable. The way certain performers simply are. The kind of presence that could hold 300 restless fairgoers silent, with nothing but a raised hand and a pause held 1/2 second longer than felt comfortable. He believed, with the total unclouded conviction only a young man can manage, that a show was a sacred thing between the people performing it and the people watching it, and that a promise made to an audience, "Stay, and something wonderful will happen," was a promise that could never under any circumstances be broken. Old Gravely used to say, fondly and a little wearily, that the boy loved the show more than the show had ever loved anyone. He was not wrong. By 1958 the rest of the cast that Richmond would come to know, and without knowing it yet, come to grieve, were as familiar to the town as its own storefronts. Otto Kessler wasn't carnival folk at all. He was Richmond born and raised, a dock worker down at the grain elevator with four arms like fence posts and a laugh that carried across the whole fairground when you heard it. It was his family's old pasture the carnival set up on every year, a fact he brought up at every opportunity, with a pride that had nothing to do with the small rental fee it earned his father. Otto didn't work the show. He came every single year, first with his own parents, and by 1958 with a wife and two small children of his own. And he was, without ever asking for the job, the closest thing the fairground had to an unofficial safety net. The man who caught the kid who climbed too high on the fence, who talked down the drunk who got too loud at the ring toss, who could be counted on every year, without fail, to be standing wherever help happened to be needed. Loretta Voss told fortunes in a tent strung with more colored scarves than the show could probably afford, and had done so for 11 seasons by then, long enough that half of the young women in every town on the circuit had at some point paid their dime to sit across from her and ask about a boy. She was privately less interested in fortunes than in people, and had a gift, real or performed. Nobody knew her, seemed entirely sure, including possibly Loretta herself, for reading exactly what a person was afraid of before they'd said a word. She kept a small dog that never once in 11 seasons willingly set foot inside the fortune-telling tent, which she found funnier than anyone else did. Iris and Ivy Marchetti, 11 years old and inseparable in the way only twins manage, had joined the show 2 years prior when their mother took work as a seamstress for the costume wagon, and had talked their way, mostly through sheer relentless charm, into tightrope and acrobats act far more polished than any two children that age had any right to perform. Richmond adored them specifically. The local paper had run a photograph of the two of them, mid-air, arms linked, the previous autumn, with the caption, "Richmond's own little wonders," which their mother had cut out and kept. Charlie Pemberton was 17, and this was his first season, a Richmond boy himself, working the show for a summer and fall to save toward tuition he hadn't fully worked out how to afford otherwise, selling balloons and shaved ice with the specific overeager enthusiasm of someone still new enough to a job to genuinely enjoy it. He had, that October, exactly 1 more week left before the show closed for winter, and he went home to his own family 3 streets over from the fairground, a fact several people would later find difficult to think about for very long. And Franklin Pope Pop, to absolutely everyone, performers and townfolk alike, a nickname so total that a fair number of people in Richmond genuinely believed it was his given name, had run the show's food stalls for going on 13 years. A broad, soft-spoken man who kept a coffee tin of butterscotch candy specifically for any child who came through his line looking like they'd had a hard day, and who was, by wide agreement, the single most trusted adult on the entire fairground. Mothers who wouldn't let their children out of sight anywhere else in the carnival would let them wander freely near Pop's stall. He had, more than once, walked a lost child the full length of the fairground back to their family rather than simply pointing the way. These were not, any of them, cursed people or marked people or people who deserved what would eventually come for them. They were, by every account that has survived, simply good. Good in the plain, unremarkable way that doesn't get written about until it's gone. The bell itself hung in a modest wooden tower at the center of the fairground, no more than 15 feet high, built new every year and torn down again each winter. A piece of set dressing that had, through sheer repetition, become something closer to a civic monument. It had no name of its own beyond simply the final bell. And its use was governed by a tradition specific enough that Richmond treated it, half jokingly, half in earnest, as a kind of honor. On the last night of the carnival of the year, once the final act had taken its final bow, the ringmaster would call for silence, and a single member of that year's audience, chosen always in some small, unpredictable way, a coin toss or a raffle number, or simply a name called out at random, would be brought up to ring the bell themselves. The show is over. The bell was understood to say, "Thank you for staying until the end. Go home, and we'll see you again next year." In 1958 it had been announced weeks in advance, with unusual ceremony, that the honor would go to whichever child guessed closest to the true weight of the prize pumpkin that would be displayed outside of Pop's stall. A contest that had, by the final week of October, become the single most argued topic among every child in Richmond under the age of 12. Nobody had thought at the time that this was anything but a nice touch, a little extra magic for the night that was already every year the closest thing the town had to magic at all. It's only in hindsight, and hindsight in Richmond has had decades to work at this particular memory, turning it over and over like a stone worn smooth, that certain details from the final week take on the weight they were never meant to carry at the time. The calliope, which had played the same rotating set of tunes without fault for as long as anyone could remember, began, in its last few nights, to catch on certain notes. Nothing anyone could really put a finger on exactly, just a hitch here, a half a second where a note that should have resolved simply didn't, before the melody caught itself and carried on as though nothing had happened. Otto's dog, a placid old retriever who had accompanied him to the fairgrounds without complaint for 6 straight years, refused on the final night to come any closer than the fence line, and would not be coaxed, bribed, or carried past it, sitting instead with its ears flat and low, steadily whining, that Otto's wife would later describe when asked as "a sound I'd never want to hear that animal make before and never want to hear again." Loretta Voss, 3 separate townspeople would later recall, had been unusually quiet in the days leading up to that final show. A woman known for her warmth and easy conversation, gone suddenly, uncharacteristically watchful, glancing more than once toward the big top with an expression one witness described only as, "It's like she was waiting for weather that hadn't shown up yet on the radio." On the afternoon of the final show itself, the young ringmaster, by every account, still cheerful, still magnetic, still utterly certain that this closing performance would be, as he reportedly told gravely with a grin, "the finest thing this show has ever put in front of an audience," made one small change to the evening's program that nobody thought to question at the time, because, well, nobody had any reason yet to think that questioning it would even matter. He asked that the bell tower's ladder, which was ordinarily left accessible from both sides for safety of whichever child would climb it that night, be repositioned so that the crowd would have a clearer, unobstructed view of the ringing from the main seating. It seemed, at the time, like nothing more than a showman's instinct for a better sightline. Nobody in Richmond that afternoon had any reason to think it would matter which side of the bell tower a person could reach. they would have all the reason in the world by morning. Chapter 2. The night the bell didn't ring. There is no surviving account of that night that agrees entirely with any other, and Richmond has, over the decades, made a kind of uneasy peace with that fact. Trauma does that to memory. It takes a single hour and breaks it into as many different hours as there were people standing in the crowd, and none of them wrong, exactly, just incomplete. Each survivor left holding one piece of a night none of them ever got to see whole. What follows is the shape those pieces make when laid next to each other. By 8 o'clock, the fairground was at as full as it has ever been. It was, by every account, a beautiful night for it, clear, cold enough for held breath to show, the kind of October dark that makes string lights look like something closer to the stars. The big top was packed to its edges. Richmond had turned out in full the way it always did for that final show. And the mood in the hour before anything went wrong was, by every surviving account, simply joyful. I mean, nobody there that night has ever described feeling so much as a flicker of warning before it happened. Whatever wrongness had been creeping around the edges of that final week, the Calliopes hitching notes, Otto's dog refusing the fence line, Loretta's uncharacteristic quiet, none of it, apparently, had followed the show into the tent itself. The ringmaster opened the evening the way he always did. No introduction, no fanfare, simply appearing at the center of the ring already mid-sentence, as though the show had been going on forever and the audience had simply been the ones to arrive late to it. It was longtime attendees who would later recall the best opening he had ever given. He was that night entirely himself, magnetic, funny, generous with the crowd in a way that made 300 strangers feel for a moment like his personal guests. The Marchetti twins performed second, as they always did. The tightrope act Richmond had come to specifically see, walking the wire in perfect mirrored steps, arms linked at the finish the way the newspaper photograph had captured the autumn before. The applause for them, several witnesses recalled, went on long enough that Iris and Ivy had to be waved back out for a second bow, both of them grinning too widely to manage a proper curtsy. Otto Kessler was there with his wife and both children, seated close enough to the ring that his youngest could see the twins' faces clearly, and would say for years afterward, long after she was old enough to understand what the night had actually meant, that Iris had winked at her during that second bow. It's a little detail that survives specifically because it was, for that little girl, the last entirely happy thing she remembered about that night. Charlie Pemberton was working the back aisle, selling the last of his balloons before the show's second half, glancing up now and then at the ring the way any 17-year-old would, half working, half simply watching. 1 week from the end of a job he'd genuinely and unexpectedly come to love. Loretta Voss was not performing. Her act came, as it always did, in the smaller tent outside during intermission. But she had come into the big top anyway that night, standing at the very back near the entrance flap rather than in her tent, which several people noticed and nobody thought to ask her about until much later, when it no longer mattered why. Pop was out his stall outside, as always, with a coffee tin and his butterscotch candies within easy reach, the smell of his grill carrying faintly even into the tent whenever the flap had opened. And somewhere above it all, and this detail nobody disputes because nobody could have missed it, hung the bell tower, its ladder now reachable only from the crowd side, exactly as the ringmaster had asked, catching the light of the ring below it in a way that several witnesses would later describe as looking, for the first time all season, genuinely beautiful. Nobody agrees on where the fire exactly started. Some say it began in the rigging above the ring, where the Marchetti twins' tightrope apparatus met the canvas ceiling in a tangling of cable and counterweight that had been rebuilt, repatched, and rebuilt again over more seasons than anyone could account for. Others insist it began further back, near the lighting rig behind the main curtain, in wiring that had been jury-rigged season after season by hands that knew the show better than they knew anything about electricity. A handful of accountants, fewer but persistent enough over the decades that Richmond has never fully dismissed them, claim it didn't start anywhere at all in an ordinary sense, that it simply just was all at once in more than one place and faster than any single spark could ever explain. What everyone agrees is how fast it moved. The canvas overhead, decades of paint and weatherproofing baked into its fibers, went up in a way that canvas built for traveling shows should never have gone up. Less like something catching fire and more like something that had simply been waiting for permission to catch fire. The rigging above the ring, already weakened by whatever had begun there, gave way within what witnesses estimated, reasonably given what fear does to a person's sense of time, as under 2 minutes. The center support beam came down first, directly through the space where the Marchetti twins had taken their final bow not 10 minutes before. They were not, thank whatever mercy be that night, left in it, still standing there when it fell. But the rigging that came down with the beam tangled the exits nearest the ring, and it was there, in a panic of 300 people trying to move all at once and through a space that had, in the space of a breath, become half its previous size, the worst of the night happened. Iris and Ivy Marchetti did not run for the exits when they might, by several accounts, have had the few extra seconds needed to make it. What survives instead from more than one witness independently in accounts given decades apart to people who had no way of comparing notes is that the girls turned back toward the ring, toward the still full seats behind them, and kept performing. Not the tightrope act, something smaller, quicker, closer to the ground, arm in arm, the way they always were, guiding, gesturing, making themselves loud and visible and watchable in the exact way 11 years of training had built into them, holding just enough of the panicking crowd's attention, just long enough to keep a stampede from becoming something even worse. One witness, a woman who would have been about their own age that night, described it plainly decades later without dramatics as, "They were still smiling, and I don't think either of them knew how not to." Neither girl made it out. Otto Kessler got his wife and both children clear within the first minute, his own dock worker's strength making short, brutal work of a section of collapsed bench that had trapped 3 other families behind it, and then having done what any father would consider his job finished, went back in. He is remembered by nearly every survivor who saw any of it as a wall of a man moving in the wrong direction through a crowd that was entirely moving in the other one. He pulled at least 6 people clear by the accounts that survive, possibly more that were never separately recorded, working his way steadily back toward the center of the collapse, toward the second support beam, which, by then, had begun to lean at an angle that anyone with sense would have called unsurvivable. He was under it when it came the rest of the way down, still braced against it, still pushing, having apparently believed what several witnesses insist was exactly the kind of belief that Otto Kessler was built out of, that if he simply held on a moment longer, one more person could get past him and get out. His own children, safe outside by then in their mother's arms, were too young to understand what had happened until years later. His wife never remarried, and kept for the rest of her life a single photograph from that final season. Otto, at the fence line of his own family's old pasture, laughing at something out of frame, the fairground lit up gold behind him. Loretta Voss did not try to leave through the main exit at all. She had known. This is the detail Richmond has turned over more than any other in the retellings that survive. She had known something was wrong before the fire ever started. Whatever gift she genuinely had or genuinely believed she had been sounding some private alarm in her for days. And on that final night, standing at the back of the tent rather than in her own fortune-telling booth, she had apparently placed herself as close as she could manage to the side exit, a smaller flap at the tent's rear, rarely used by the audience, but functional and in a real emergency exactly the kind of second route that could have meant the difference for dozens of people. Except that flap had been sealed, for reasons nobody was ever able to determine. A set dressing decision, a scenic backdrop erected against it that final week to frame a new photo opportunity, display an oversight, a coincidence. Take your pick of explanations offered in the years since. Not locked, simply painted over. The canvas backdrop tacked directly across the seam of the exit itself, indistinguishable in the low light from the rest of the tent wall unless you already knew exactly where to look. Loretta knew exactly where to look. She spent, by the account of two other people who survived near enough to her to describe it afterward, nearly a full minute tearing at the painted canvas with her bare hands and screaming for people to come to her, to this way here, and several people did reach her and did get through. In the last handful of seconds before the smoke in that corner of the tent became something that no one could breathe through and continue tearing at anything at all. She did not make it through herself. The two survivors who owed her that exit have never in any account on record described her as anything other than the reason why they've lived. Charlie Pemberton was caught in the stampede near the main gate. He was 17 years old, and 1 week from the end of his first season, still holding, several witnesses noted, with a specific kind of horror reserved for details too small and human to be anything but true, a half-sold bundle of balloons that he never let go of even as the crowd behind him surged. He was not a large young man. He had no training for what that crowd became in its final desperate seconds towards an exit gate that had not been built to move 300 panicked people through at once. What accounts survive of his final moments are mercifully the least detailed of anyone's, not because nobody saw, but because people who did have, without exception, declined, across some 60 years, to describe it further than saying he went down early near the front, and that the crowd behind him did not stop coming. He was found near the gate the following morning. His family's grief 3 streets from the fairground was the kind Richmond still speaks of carefully, even now. Franklin Pope was outside where the fire began. He was safely clear of the tent entirely, by every reasonable measure of that night's chaos, a fact several people who loved him have spent decades wishing had simply been enough. It was not enough, because Pop did not stay clear of it. He went in twice by two separate accounts, possibly a third time that nobody survived to confirm. Both confirmed trips were for children. A boy about 8 found disoriented near the collapsed benches, and a cluster of 3 girls, cousins, visiting from out of county for the show, who had become separated from every adult they knew in the first chaotic seconds of the collapse. Pop got all 4 of them out, delivered personally into whatever waiting arms he could find at the gate, the coffee tin butterscotch candy calm of him, apparently entirely undisturbed even as everything around him was not. It was on his third trip in. Accounts here grow thin, understandably, given how few people remained inside that fire by that point to witness anything at all, that the smoke that had claimed Loretta Valsa's corner of the tent found him too. He is remembered in nearly every account that survives, less for how he died than for the plain and steady fact of what he did with every minute he had left once he understood the fire wasn't going to spare anyone who stayed. Several people who owe him their childhoods have, in the decades since, named their own children after him. Aw. By the time the flames were finally beaten back by Richmond's volunteer fire company, arriving faster than anyone had any right to expect for a town of that size, working through most of the night, the big top was blackened, skeletal ruin, and the fairgrounds that had 12 hours earlier been the most joyful place in the county had become something the town would spend the next 60-some years trying and failing to fully put words to. The final count of the dead, when it was finally settled in the days that followed, numbered in the dozens. Performers and townsfolk both, the show's own family and Richmond's intermingled in a grief so total that for years afterward the town avoided, by unspoken agreement, drawing too sharp a distinction between the two. Old Gravely was found alive, badly burned, pulled from the wreckage near what had been the performance entrance, and would live another 11 years, though by every account from those years never again as anything more than a shadow of a man who had run that show. He never spoke publicly in all that time of what he had seen in the tense final minutes. He is buried in Richmond's own cemetery, a detail the town has always found strange and never quite discussed, given he was not by any measure but the last one a Richmond man. The bell tower, remarkably, was one of the only structures on the fairground left standing. Nobody rang it. There was, in the exhausted, grief-shattered hours after the fire was finally out, no ceremony left in anyone for any kind of gesture. By the time cooler heads might have considered it appropriate anyway, in the days and the weeks that followed, the town realized there was no one left who held the authority to call for it. Old Gravely was in no state to give the order. The show's other senior performers were dead, or scattered, or too shattered themselves to want to be found. And the young ringmaster, the boy who had opened the night show, already mid-sentence, who had asked that very afternoon for a better sight line to that bell tower that would never again be used for its intended purpose, was never found at all. Not among the dead, whose remains, however difficult the identifications, were eventually all accounted for. Not among the survivors, none of whom in 60-some years of asking have ever claimed to have seen him after the fire began. He was simply gone, in the plainest and least satisfying sense of the word, as though the fire that took nearly everyone else the show had ever loved had, for him alone, made some other arrangement entirely. Richmond would not properly understand for a very long time exactly how right that impression was. Whoo! Yo. So I've already read through this whole news story. Um, I usually try to read through larger novels like this first before reading to you all. And let me tell you, first read through, I bawled my eyes out. So if you're crying now, if you have a little tissue because you got a little issue, don't worry about it. You're not alone, okay? It was intense. And as somebody who has experienced and suffered a house fire, it was hard to get through on first read. So if that's also happening for you, I'm with you there. Especially if you've suffered a loss to in a fire. It's brutal. But you know, we're going to learn to survive, right? That's the whole key point of the camp name, Richmond Survival Camp. So we're going to survive. I'm going to read the next chapters in other videos because they are very long. There are 13 chapters. We've done the opening note, chapters 1 and chapters 2. We've got several more left before now and October. I'm going to release these throughout, let's see, the next couple of weeks to next month and such. I'm going to set them all up. And that way, you'll have something new to look forward to all the way up until camp. But don't worry, I won't release them too close to camp because I prefer you have all the story up front like I do. So that you can plan accordingly. Get your little outfits together, get your little tents together, however it's going to be that you'll need to gather to survive. I'm really excited. I think this is super cool, and I'm loving what Mr. Geo's doing, and I'm hoping that you enjoy my storytelling of him books. That is all for right now. I'll see you in the next video. I will link below in the description the Discord server for camp, the in-world group for camp, the websites you can stay tuned of all the information and various locations, as well as my own if you're interested in joining my Discord or my Facebook page to stay tuned on when I'm dropping the next video. As always, I appreciate you being here with me. Bye for now.